What if I told you that one moment of weakness in a barren wasteland sealed the fate of an entire nation forever? Buried within the family records of Genesis exists a name that would become the eternal adversary of the divine, Amalek. But here is what truly puzzles researchers and theologians alike. Why would the Creator, who showed mercy to Egypt despite their centuries of enslavement and pardoned Nineveh despite their cruelty, pronounce total warfare against these wanderers of the wasteland? What horrific deed did they carry out that provoked the most terrifying proclamation found anywhere in holy text? I will utterly wipe out every trace of them from existence beneath the sky. The Amalekites were not simply another opposing force. They shared bloodlines with Israel, coming directly from Abraham's own grandson, yet something became deeply corrupted within their very being. Imagine this scene: worn-out former slaves, at last liberated after 4 centuries of captivity, stumbling through the barren lands. Who strikes against them? Not the powerful armies chasing them, but nomadic attackers who deliberately targeted the most vulnerable, massacring little ones and elderly people trailing at the back. Why would they do this? The explanation uncovers something so troubling about the darker side of humanity that the Almighty declared, "This ends now." A monarch would sacrifice everything because he showed mercy to their leader. A holy man would transform into an executioner. Even in our present day, their very name holds an enigma. How does an entire population disappear so thoroughly that those who dig through ancient ruins can barely locate any evidence of their existence? Get ready to learn why the Amalekites became the singular adversary that the Almighty vowed to personally annihilate. Every people group has an origin, and the tale of the Amalekites begins with a lineage that traces straight back to Abraham himself. To grasp who these individuals truly were, we must journey back to the book of Genesis and examine a family branch that would eventually create one of Israel's fiercest opponents. Esau, the twin sibling of Jacob, fathered multiple children. His eldest son received the name Eliphaz. Now, Eliphaz kept a concubine, a woman of lower status than a primary spouse, and her name was Timnah. Genesis chapter 36 verse 12 states clearly, Timnah served as a concubine to Eliphaz, the son of Esau, and through her, Amalek was born to Eliphaz. This marks the very beginning. An infant came into the world, and he was called Amalek. Consider the significance of this connection. Amalek descended from Esau as his grandson, making him the great-grandson of Isaac and placing him just 4 generations removed from Abraham. The Amalekites were not outsiders or unknown peoples from faraway territories. The blood of the founding fathers flowed through their bodies. They belonged to the same extended family, distant relatives to the Israelites, who would eventually come through Jacob's line. That identical chapter in Genesis proceeds to count Amalek among the tribal leaders of Edom. Verse 16 names him directly: Korah, Gatham, and Amalek. These represented the chieftains who traced their ancestry to Eliphaz within Edom, all descending from Ada. He was not merely one descendant among many. He rose to become a chieftain, a person of influence, someone whose identity commanded respect and power among those who came from Esau. This family connection matters enormously because it demonstrates that the Amalekites did not appear from nothing. They possessed ancestry, cultural background, and a position within the lineage extending back to the sacred promise made between Abraham and the divine. Yet somehow this particular branch of the ancestral tree would develop in an entirely opposite direction from their kinsmen. While other offspring of Esau made their homes in the highland regions of Seir, the Amalekites selected an alternative route. They migrated southward into the brutal, merciless desert regions. The Negev wilderness and the Sinai region became their dwelling places. Territories where water was extremely rare, plant life was minimal, and staying alive demanded specialized expertise and abilities. The Negev occupies the southern boundary of what would eventually form Israel's domain. It serves as a transitional area connecting the cultivated territories in the north with the extensive wastelands spreading southward. The Sinai region extends even further toward the south, a tremendous span of arid land, mountain ranges, and stone-covered ground. These were not locations where farming was practical or urban centers could be constructed. These were territories meant for those who mastered the art of enduring extreme circumstances. The Amalekites became perfectly suited to this brutal landscape. They memorized the location of every water source and underground spring. They understood which wadis, those dry stream channels, would briefly overflow when the infrequent storms arrived. They mastered the skills of finding passage through mountain gaps and crossing vast open desert terrain. This expertise became their most valuable possession. By claiming these lands, the Amalekites stationed themselves along the southern pathway leading into Canaan. Any traveling group moving from Egypt toward the land of promise would necessarily travel through or alongside Amalekite lands. The principal commerce routes connecting Egypt to the northeastern territories passed directly through these areas. This positioning was not accidental. The Amalekites controlled land of vital importance. They never constructed magnificent urban centers or founded lasting communities like neighboring peoples did. Rather, they stayed constantly on the move, relocating their encampments based on seasonal changes and wherever they could find provisions. Their shelters could be dismantled and transported rapidly. This constant movement provided them with benefits that peoples living in fixed locations never possessed. They could attack swiftly and then vanish into the wilderness where pursuers could not track them. The terrain itself served as their partner. Outsiders lacked familiarity with the geography. They had no knowledge of water sources or which mountain trails could actually be crossed. But the Amalekites possessed complete understanding of every boulder and every concealed canyon. This deep familiarity with their surroundings transformed them into a serious threat to anyone crossing through the lands they claimed. Here is something that confuses many people who study the Bible. The Amalekites show up in Scripture even before the person named Amalek came into existence. This appears contradictory initially, but it actually reveals something significant about how ancient civilizations viewed geography and group identity. In Genesis chapter 14, we discover Abraham participating in a rescue operation. Multiple rulers had engaged in warfare, and Abraham's nephew Lot had been taken prisoner. Abraham assembled his skilled fighters and chased after the rulers who had seized Lot. Verse 7 outlines the path these rulers traveled. Then they reversed course and traveled to En-Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and they subdued the entire region belonging to the Amalekites, along with the Amorites residing in Hazezon Tamar. Hold on, the region belonging to the Amalekites. Yet this occurred during Abraham's lifetime, generations before his great-great-grandson Amalek even existed. How is this possible? The explanation is that Moses, the author of Genesis, was portraying the landscape using terminology his audience would recognize. He was communicating, "They subdued the area that you currently recognize as Amalekite land." It resembles saying Columbus voyaged to the Americas, despite that title not existing during his era. This mention demonstrates that when Moses composed his writings, the Amalekites had become so firmly rooted in that area that the land itself carried their identification. Their occupation had turned lasting and widely known. Everyone recognized Amalekite land. It represented an established element of the geographical terrain. The reality that Moses employed this description indicates the Amalekites had inhabited those southern desert areas for an extremely extended period. Multiple generations had come and gone. They had claimed those territories as their own so thoroughly that the region carried their title. This was not a recently formed group still searching for their homeland. When Israel finally met them, they represented an ancient established force in the Negev and Sinai. Existing in the desert influenced every aspect of Amalekite civilization. Agricultural work was impossible. Sufficient water and productive soil simply did not exist. Constructing commercial centers was not feasible. They lived as wanderers, perpetually relocating. So they built a society focused on something different, seizing what others had created. The Amalekites transformed into plunderers. This was neither occasional nor random. Plundering evolved into their entire existence, their financial system, their core character. They monitored the commercial paths crossing their domain, merchant convoys transporting precious cargo from Egypt toward Mesopotamia or from Arabia toward Canaan needed to traverse the territories the Amalekites dominated. These convoys were exposed to danger. They moved at slow speeds, burdened with goods. Their protectors were frequently small in number, employed to guard against ordinary thieves, yet unprepared for coordinated military assaults. The Amalekites would observe and remain patient. They memorized the pathways. They understood where convoys would rest overnight. They recognized where the landscape provided them superiority. When they attacked rapidly. Combat in desert conditions demands swiftness and the element of surprise. The Amalekites would assault without warning, defeating their victims before any structured resistance could materialize. They would grab anything precious, aromatic substances, fabrics, metalwork, animals, then disappear back into the wasteland. Before assistance could reach the scene, the attackers had departed, dispersed throughout terrain that outsiders could not cross. This way of living demanded specific capabilities and principles. Amalekite males received combat training from childhood. They mastered riding, fighting, and withstanding the difficulties of desert journeys. They learned to function with minimal water and limited nourishment when required. They grew hardened, resilient, and pitiless. Showing compassion meant vulnerability. Pausing meant death. Yet plundering was not merely about staying alive. It evolved into a source of honor, a standard for measuring a man's value. Triumphant raids delivered riches and recognition. The most daring raiders rose to leadership positions. Accounts of courageous attacks were shared beside evening fires. Young males matured listening to stories of their fathers' and forefathers' achievements, imagining their own opportunity to demonstrate their abilities in combat. This culture also guaranteed the Amalekites were perpetually in conflict with somebody. Neighbors seeking peace do not welcome being plundered. Traders whose convoys suffered attacks desired vengeance. Established communities whose towns were looted pursued either defense or payback. The Amalekites existed in an endless condition of warfare, which only strengthened their combat culture and their dependence on brutality. The Amalekites descended from Esau's bloodline, placing them within the larger Edomite clan. However, family connections in ancient times were complicated, and shared ancestry did not automatically produce harmony or companionship. Other offspring of Esau inhabited different territories and followed different ways of living. Numerous Edomite groups settled in the highland territory of Seir, positioned east of the Araba Valley. These highlands provided superior security and greater resources compared to the exposed wasteland. As time passed, these Edomites constructed settlements, cultivated crops in the lowlands, and created a more permanent lifestyle. The Amalekites made a different choice. They stayed in the southern wastelands, preserving their wandering existence. This separation in location and customs created distance between them and their Edomite relatives. They shared bloodlines, but they did not follow identical practices or pursue identical goals. Occasionally, this connection produced shared advantages. When circumstances favored them, the Amalekites might partner with other Edomite groups. If a shared threat endangered both populations, they might unite their strength. Weddings between households formed bonds and partnerships. Exchange of merchandise and knowledge occurred between the groups, yet the connection never reached complete merger or solidarity. The Amalekites preserved their unique character. They did not view themselves as simply another Edomite tribe. They were the Amalekites, distinct, self-governing, obeying their own chieftains and practicing their own customs. Their wasteland traditions and plundering lifestyle distinguished them from the more established Edomite populations. This self-reliance meant they frequently operated independently. When the Amalekites chose to raid a convoy or assault a community, they required no approval or consensus from other Edomite authorities. They reached their own conclusions and accepted their own dangers. If those conclusions produced repercussions, those repercussions affected them exclusively. The Edomites residing in Seir built a more structured civilization over time, ultimately creating a monarchy with a line of successive rulers. The Amalekites never pursued this direction. They stayed organized by tribes, guided by chieftains whose power derived from capability and achievement rather than inherited succession. This alternative governmental framework further separated them from their Edomite kinsmen. Northward from Amalekite domains stretched the territory of Canaan, populated by diverse groups who had built independent city-states and farming settlements. The Amalekites' closeness to these Canaanite populations guaranteed contact was unavoidable, although the character of these contacts differed. The Canaanite city-states embodied an entirely distinct society from the wandering Amalekites. They possessed fortifications, sacred buildings, structured administrations, and farming-based economies. They conducted commerce with remote regions and built advanced cultures. From their protected urban centers, Canaanite monarchs governed surrounding regions and gathered payments from outlying villages. For the Amalekites, the Canaanites symbolized both possibility and restriction. The Canaanite urban centers held great wealth, yet they also maintained strong defenses. Assaulting a fortified urban center demanded specialized warfare tools and prolonged commitment, capabilities that wandering raiders could not sustain. So launching direct assaults on Canaanite urban centers was seldom feasible. Rather, the Amalekites concentrated on easier prey. Agricultural communities beyond protective walls lacked defenses. The gathering season, when grain was collected and put away, presented chances for attacks. Wanderers and modest convoys traveling between urban centers could be ambushed. The Amalekites mastered the skill of taking whatever possible without triggering the complete armed response of a Canaanite ruler. Occasionally, political situations opened doors for partnership. A Canaanite ruler might employ Amalekite plunderers as hired soldiers when engaged in conflict with a competing city-state. The Amalekites would receive compensation and stolen goods, while the Canaanite ruler obtained extra fighting power without sustaining a permanent military force. These deals were short-lived and founded entirely on shared benefit, not loyalty or genuine alliance. During other periods, Canaanite rulers would assemble retaliatory campaigns against the Amalekites if their attacks grew too destructive. A ruler could not permit his domains to be looted without reaction, or he would seem powerless. So periodically, Canaanite forces would advance into the wasteland, attempting to discipline the attackers and prevent future strikes. These campaigns seldom managed to capture the swift-moving Amalekites, but they communicated a warning. Regardless of these encounters, the Amalekites never merged into Canaanite society. They did not embrace Canaanite traditions, beliefs, or ways of living. They stayed apart, maintaining their desert customs and their plundering livelihood. The Canaanites embodied established society, everything the Amalekites had decided against becoming. Most ancient civilizations constructed their financial systems on farming or commerce. They cultivated fields, bred animals, manufactured products, or enabled the movement of merchandise between distant territories. The Amalekites selected an entirely different direction. Their financial system was parasitic, relying on seizing what others had created. Plundering was not an addition to their livelihood. It was their livelihood. The riches of the Amalekites originated from the efforts of others. When traders labored for months to accumulate precious merchandise and carry it across desert pathways, the Amalekites lingered nearby to grab those goods in one brutal moment. When farmers dedicated seasons to growing harvests, the Amalekites showed up at collection time to claim the yield. This financial approach offered certain benefits. The Amalekites had no need to dedicate time to sowing and nurturing fields. They had no requirement to preserve commercial connections or construct production facilities. They had no need for lasting communities with all the supporting structures that demands. Their requirements were more basic, and they could direct their efforts toward combat and movement. Herds represented a significant portion of their possessions. During raids, they captured sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. These creatures supplied nourishment, travel capability, and goods for exchange. Massive herds signified prosperity and triumph. A triumphant raider could grow wealthy in livestock, utilizing his fortune to maintain multiple wives and numerous offspring, elevating his standing and power. Yet this financial foundation generated built-in uncertainty. The Amalekites manufactured nothing on their own. Their fortune shifted according to raid outcomes. A sequence of triumphant strikes could bring them prosperity, but if likely victims strengthened their protections, or if mightier powers pushed the Amalekites from productive raiding zones, their fortune could rapidly vanish. This parasitic livelihood also required others to stay productive. If they demolished every settlement nearby, slaughtered every merchant, and scared off every convoy, they would possess nothing remaining to plunder. So there existed a twisted equilibrium to preserve. Plunder sufficiently to thrive, but not excessively so that the origins of fortune vanished completely. The reliance on stolen goods molded Amalekite principles and outlooks. Why labor when seizing is possible? Why construct when grabbing is available? Why produce when stealing works? These mindsets, reinforced across generations, grew profoundly rooted in their society. Labor belonged to others. Seizing represented the Amalekite practice. Well before Israel met the Amalekites at Rephidim, these wasteland attackers had previously built a frightening standing throughout the territory. Their title was recognized, their tactics were comprehended, their brutality was acknowledged. This standing functioned as both an offensive tool and protective barrier. Terror represents a mighty instrument in combat and endurance. When wanderers learned they would traverse Amalekite domain, they readied for the harshest outcome. They employed additional protectors. They journeyed in bigger assemblies. They observed continuously for any indication of attackers. This terror could occasionally prevent strikes. The Amalekites might conclude a thoroughly equipped convoy was not worth the danger. Yet terror also separated the Amalekites from others. Other populations did not pursue companionship with them. They received no invitations to participate in coalitions or commercial arrangements. They were circumvented whenever feasible and confronted when unavoidable. The Amalekites were recognized as opponents, as dangers, as individuals requiring vigilance. This separation, nonetheless, did not trouble them. They had selected their direction. Accounts regarding Amalekite strikes traveled across the territory. Those who endured recounted abrupt assaults arriving without advance notice. Traders who forfeited complete convoys depicted the swiftness and brutality of Amalekite combat. These accounts reinforced the standing and extended the terror further. Every generation absorbed tales of Amalekite strikes, discovering to exercise caution when crossing the southern territories. What rendered the Amalekites especially terrifying was their readiness to assault the defenseless. Numerous ancient combat traditions maintained standards about fighting. You battled fighters, not women and youngsters. You provided opponents opportunity to yield. You demonstrated compassion toward the conquered. The Amalekites rejected these standards. They perceived defenselessness as possibility, not as justification for holding back. This standing for mercilessness signified that when individuals spotted Amalekite attackers drawing near, they understood to anticipate no compassion. Yielding would not rescue them. Begging would prove useless. The Amalekites would seize whatever they desired and abandon only what held no worth to them. This awareness produced horror, and horror was precisely what the Amalekites sought. Horrified individuals cannot resist effectively. They lose control, disperse, and commit errors. When Egypt's enslaved Hebrews traversed the Red Sea and entered the wilderness, the Amalekites had been attacking the southern wasteland territories for generations. Their standing was firmly confirmed. Their domain was unmistakably marked. Their tactics were recognized. They represented a familiar element in the territory, hazardous, merciless, and perpetually observing for chances to assault the powerless. The Israelites had recently observed something unimaginable. They had crossed through the Red Sea upon dry terrain, while waters remained suspended like barriers on each flank. They had witnessed Pharaoh's military forces perish in the waters pursuing them. They achieved liberty after 400 years of bondage in Egypt. However, liberty in the wilderness arrived with fresh difficulties. They voyaged across the wasteland, and the expedition proved demanding. These were not disciplined fighters or seasoned wanderers. They were households, males, females, youngsters, and aged individuals who had devoted their existence to forming bricks in Egypt. Currently, they marched across unforgiving landscape with restricted provisions, discovering how to depend on the divine for each day's sustenance. The Israelites reached a location named Rephidim. They established camp there, but a difficulty arose. No water existed. The people experienced thirst, and their grievances intensified. They argued with Moses, insisting on water. Moses pleaded to the Almighty, and the Lord instructed him to hit a stone at Horeb. Moses followed the command, and water flowed forth for the people to consume. This was the circumstance at Rephidim, an enormous assembly of former captives, drained from traveling, struggling with dehydration and grievances, only starting to comprehend what following the divine through the wasteland required. They were exposed. They were chaotic. They presented no danger to anyone. Then Exodus chapter 17 verse 8 documents what occurred afterward. The Amalekites arrived and struck the Israelites at Rephidim. No advance notice, no instigation, no land disagreement or earlier clash. The Amalekites merely arrived and struck. Israel had not entered Amalekite domain requesting anything. They had not endangered the Amalekites or plundered their encampments. They were displaced people crossing through the wasteland, struggling to endure. Yet the Amalekites spotted possibility where others might have spotted fellow humans requiring assistance. They spotted thousands of individuals with belongings, animals, and zero military structure. They spotted simple prey. This assault was not regarding protection or security. It concerned hunting. The Amalekites observed a defenseless population and chose to strike. This instant would establish the connection between these two populations for centuries ahead. The Amalekite assault at Rephidim was not merely unprovoked, it was deliberate and vicious in its performance. They did not confront Israel's mightiest fighters to an honorable contest. They utilized a method that exposed something sinister regarding their nature. Years afterward, Moses would recall for the people this assault. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 and 18, he informed them, "Recall what the Amalekites performed against you during the journey when you departed from Egypt. When you were exhausted and depleted, they encountered you on your travels and struck everyone trailing at the back. They possessed no reverence for the divine." Reflect on what this signifies. When a substantial assembly moves across challenging landscape, certain individuals naturally fall behind. The aged cannot march as rapidly. Ill individuals battle to maintain speed. Young children exhaust quickly and decelerate. Expectant mothers require more frequent rest. These defenseless individuals wind up trailing the moving assembly. The Amalekites deliberately focused on these stragglers. They did not assault the front of the formation where the most capable men traveled. They struck from the rear, cutting down those unable to protect themselves. Aged men and women who had endured decades of captivity in Egypt were slain as they battled to remain with their households. Youngsters were struck down as they walked. Ill and feeble individuals already enduring hardship received no compassion. This was not combat. This was massacre. Fighters battle other fighters, yet the Amalekites opted to slay the helpless. They selected the simplest victims, those unable to resist, those presenting no danger. This strategic choice demonstrated a total absence of human sympathy. Moses included an essential observation. They possessed no reverence for the divine. The Amalekites understood what had occurred in Egypt. Information spread in the ancient world. Accounts of the afflictions, the division of the Red Sea, and the annihilation of Pharaoh's military forces would have circulated across the territory. Everyone understood that Israel's deity was mighty and guarding over his people, yet the Amalekites showed no concern. They displayed no respect, no prudence, no regard for the deity who had recently performed wonders. They spotted defenseless individuals and struck without regard for heavenly safeguarding or ethical limits. This lack of fear was not bravery. It represented a dismissal of any power beyond their personal wishes. The Amalekite assault compelled Israel to react. They could not simply flee. Where would they escape? They needed to remain and battle. Moses summoned a man called Joshua and provided him precise directions. Exodus chapter 17 verse 9 documents Moses' order. Select some of our men and advance to combat the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will position myself atop the elevation with the staff of the divine in my grasp. This marked Joshua's initial emergence as a combat commander. He was not a seasoned general. Like everyone else, he had existed as a captive in Egypt. Yet Moses entrusted him with this essential assignment. Joshua performed precisely what Moses requested. He chose men from the Israelites to assemble a combat unit. Meanwhile, Moses ascended to the summit of a neighboring elevation, bringing Aaron and a man called Hur alongside him. Moses elevated the staff of the divine, the very staff raised above the Red Sea, the same staff that had delivered afflictions upon Egypt. Verses 11 and 12 portray what transpired throughout the conflict. Whenever Moses maintained his arms elevated, the Israelites were succeeding. Yet whenever he dropped his arms, the Amalekites were succeeding. When Moses' arms became fatigued, they retrieved a stone and positioned it beneath him, and he rested upon it. Aaron and Hur supported his arms, one positioned on each flank, ensuring his arms stayed firm until darkness arrived. This represented an unusual method of conducting conflict. Joshua and his fighters performed the physical combat on the field, striking with blades and protecting against Amalekite assaults. Yet the resolution of the conflict relied upon Moses maintaining his arms elevated on the summit. When his limbs were raised, Israel dominated. When his limbs descended from weariness, Amalek obtained superiority. Aaron and Hur understood what was occurring. They located a stone for Moses to rest upon, removing some of the bodily strain from him. Then they positioned themselves on opposite flanks, physically supporting his limbs when he could no longer manage independently. They sustained this arrangement until darkness fell. Verse 13 provides the outcome. Thus Joshua defeated the Amalekite forces through the blade. The conflict was secured. Israel's initial armed confrontation concluded in triumph, yet everyone recognized this triumph originated from the divine, not from their personal combat expertise. The elevated staff represented reliance on heavenly might, and that reliance created the distinction. Following the conflict's conclusion and Israel's defeat of the Amalekite assault, the Almighty addressed Moses. What he declared differed from anything stated regarding any other population. This was not merely a proclamation concerning one conflict. It represented an announcement that would resonate across generations. Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, documents the divine words. Then the Lord declared to Moses, "Inscribe this upon a scroll as something requiring remembrance, and ensure Joshua receives this message, for I will thoroughly eliminate the identity of Amalek from beneath the sky." The divine ordered this pledge be documented permanently. It required remembrance, and particularly Joshua, who had recently commanded Israel's troops in conflict, needed to receive and comprehend this heavenly ruling. The expression, "eliminate the identity of Amalek from beneath the sky," was unconditional. The divine was not discussing defeating them in conflict or pushing them away. He was discussing total elimination, absolute destruction, the conclusion of their existence as a population. Their actual identity would be erased from the earth. Why such a harsh declaration? Other populations had resisted Israel. Egypt had held them captive for 400 years, yet the divine did not order Egypt's complete destruction. He evaluated Egypt through afflictions and destroyed Pharaoh's forces, yet the population continued existing. The Amalekites, nonetheless, obtained a different verdict. The explanation resides in their actions. They struck without justification. They focused on the defenseless deliberately. They displayed no reverence for the divine, despite his evident might and safeguarding over Israel. This was not simply a combat action. It represented an action exposing something essentially rotten regarding Amalekite nature and society. Moses' reaction to the divine announcement was instant. Verse 15 states, "Moses constructed an altar and titled it, 'The Lord represents my standard.'" The title reflected recent events. The divine had served as Israel's standard, their gathering focus, their origin of triumph. The elevated staff upon the summit had functioned like a combat banner the soldiers could observe. Then Moses delivered another declaration documented in verse 16. He stated, "Since arms were elevated against the seat of the Lord will maintain conflict against the Amalekites across every generation." This represented conflict that would not conclude with one engagement or one generation. This was eternal conflict, persisting through time until the heavenly ruling achieved fulfillment. The expression, "arms were elevated against the seat of the Lord," clarifies why this conflict differed. When the Amalekites struck Israel, they were not merely striking a collection of individuals. They were striking the people the divine had selected, the people he was safeguarding, the people through whom he was displaying himself to humanity. Striking Israel meant striking the divine's intentions and designs. The Amalekites had established themselves as adversaries, not solely of Israel, but of the Almighty personally. Time elapsed, and Israel progressed through the wilderness. Eventually, they established camp at Kadesh Barnea, along the boundary of the Promised Territory. Moses dispatched 12 scouts to investigate Canaan and deliver a summary. The scouts came back following 40 days, bearing remarkable information regarding the territory's richness, yet 10 of them also delivered alarming accounts concerning the power of the inhabitants residing there. The Israelites' reaction was defiance. They declined to enter the territory regardless of the divine's pledge to provide it to them. They even discussed selecting fresh leadership and going back to Egypt. The divine's fury intensified against them, and he announced that this generation would not enter the promised territory. They would roam through the wasteland for 40 years, until every adult who had defied the divine passed away. When the people received this verdict, they abruptly reversed their position. Now they desired to enter the territory. Moses cautioned them against proceeding, clarifying that the Almighty no longer supported them in this endeavor, yet they refused to heed his words. Numbers chapter 14 verse 44 portrays what occurred. Regardless, in their arrogance, they advanced toward the elevated point in the highland region, although neither Moses nor the Ark of the Lord's covenant departed from the encampment. They proceeded without Moses' guidance and without the Ark, the representation of the divine presence. They were functioning independently now. Verse 45 provides the outcome. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites, who resided in that highland region, descended and struck them and drove them back completely to Hormah. The Amalekites occupied portions of the southern highland region. When Israel attempted to invade without the divine's approval, the Amalekites united with the Canaanites to protect the land. This engagement differed entirely from Rephidim. At Rephidim, Israel possessed the divine's backing and triumphed despite lacking experience. Here they dared to battle without the divine presence, and they suffered total defeat. The Amalekites assisted in driving them completely back to Hormah, causing severe casualties. This loss delivered a harsh lesson to Israel. They could not secure victories through personal strength or personal timing. Triumph demanded compliance and heavenly backing. The Amalekites, in the meantime, had effectively protected land and repelled an invasion effort. Decades afterward, as Israel readied to ultimately enter the Promised Territory, an unusual occurrence took place. The ruler of Moab, frightened by Israel's nearness to his domain, employed a prophet called Balaam to place a curse upon Israel. Yet each time Balaam parted his lips to curse, the Almighty placed blessings in his speech instead. Balaam delivered multiple prophecies regarding Israel and the surrounding populations. One of these prophecies directly referenced the Amalekites. Numbers chapter 24 verse 20 captures the moment. Then Balaam observed Amalek and delivered his prophecy. Amalek stood first among the populations, yet their conclusion will bring total annihilation. The expression, first among the populations, has received various interpretations. It could indicate Amalek being an ancient, firmly rooted people. Alternatively, it could signify they were the initial population to strike Israel following the Exodus, the first to raise aggression against the divinely chosen people. Regardless, Balaam recognized that the Amalekites held a notable standing and background, yet that background would conclude. Their conclusion will bring total annihilation. This was not Balaam's personal viewpoint or desire. It represented a prophetic announcement from the Almighty. The identical deity who had pledged at Rephidim to eliminate Amalek's identity was presently validating through a foreign prophet that this verdict would certainly occur. Balaam's prophecy contributed another dimension to the heavenly ruling against Amalek. Moses was not the sole person who had received the divine's pledge of their annihilation. Now, through Balaam, the neighboring populations received it as well. The Moabites, the Midianites, and anyone else attending when Balaam delivered these prophecies understood that the Amalekites were designated for total annihilation by Israel's deity. Following Joshua's passing, Israel entered a challenging era. The book of Judges depicts recurring patterns where Israel would descend into wrongdoing. The Almighty would permit adversaries to subjugate them, the population would plead for assistance, and the divine would elevate a judge to rescue them. The Amalekites emerge multiple times throughout this era, consistently as oppressors or plunderers. The initial reference appears during the account of Eglon, ruler of Moab. Judges chapter 3 verse 13 states, "Recruiting the Ammonites and Amalekites to accompany him, Eglon arrived and struck Israel, and they seized control of the city of palms." The Amalekites constituted part of an alliance with Moab and Ammon to assault and subjugate Israel. They assisted in capturing Jericho, the city of palms, and Israel served Eglon for 18 years before the divine elevated Ehud to rescue them. Afterward, the Amalekites participated in an even more catastrophic campaign. When the Midianites subjugated Israel during Gideon's era, the Amalekites stood alongside them. Judges chapter 6 verses 3 through 5 depict the circumstances. Whenever the Israelites sowed their fields, the Midianites, Amalekites, and additional eastern populations invaded the territory. They established camps across the territory and demolished the harvests extending to Gaza and preserved nothing living for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They arrived with their herds and their shelters resembling swarms of locusts. Counting them or their camels proved impossible. They invaded the territory to devastate it. This represented methodical destruction. Each year when Israel sowed fields and labored on their lands, these plunderers would appear in enormous quantities. They were not merely stealing provisions, they were demolishing Israel's capacity to survive. They abandoned nothing, no harvests, no herds, nothing. The comparison to locusts proved fitting. They arrived in crushing quantities and consumed everything. Verse 6 provides the outcome. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they pleaded to the Lord for assistance. The Amalekites participated in a campaign that drove Israel to hopelessness. This was not sporadic plundering. This represented yearly devastation extending 7 years. The Amalekites had resumed their established patterns, uniting with others to exploit Israel's defenselessness. The divine elevated Gideon to rescue Israel from the Midianite Amalekite subjugation. Through a sequence of miraculous indicators, the Almighty diminished Gideon's forces from 32,000 fighters to merely 300. Ensuring Israel would recognize the triumph originated from the divine, not from military capability. With these 300 fighters, Gideon assaulted the enormous Midianite encampment during darkness, generating alarm and disorder. The opposing forces escaped, and Gideon's fighters chased them. Judges chapter 7 verse 24 states, "Gideon dispatched messengers across the highland territory of Ephraim, declaring, 'Descend against the Midianites and control the waters of the Jordan ahead of them, extending to Beth-barah.' Thus all the fighters of Ephraim were summoned, and they controlled the waters of the Jordan, extending to Beth-barah. Additional Israelite clans joined the chase, blocking escape paths. Yet the Midianite rulers, Zebah and Zalmunna, escaped with 15,000 fighters, everything remaining of their enormous military force. Gideon continued pursuing without stopping. Judges chapter 8 verse 10 describes their location. Now Zebah and Zalmunna remained in Karkor with forces numbering approximately 15,000 fighters. Everything remaining of the armies of the eastern populations, 120,000 armed fighters, had perished. The chase carried Gideon through domain controlled by the Amalekites and their partners. His 300 fighters were drained, having battled throughout darkness, then pursued the adversary across numerous miles. Verses 4 and 5 state, Gideon and his 300 fighters, drained yet maintaining the chase, reached the Jordan and traversed it. He addressed the inhabitants of Succoth, "Provide my soldiers some bread. They are depleted, and I continue pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the rulers of Midian." The settlements in this territory, Succoth and Peniel, declined to assist Gideon. They feared that if Gideon failed to seize the Midianite rulers, those rulers would return and discipline anyone who had supported him. They would not risk backing Gideon's chase. Regardless of depletion and absence of backing, Gideon persisted. Verse 11 describes his strategy. Gideon advanced through the pathway of the wanderers east of Nobah and Jogbehah and struck the unsuspecting forces. He utilized the paths that wandering populations, including the Amalekites, traveled through that territory. He understood the landscape sufficiently to approach unnoticed. Verse 12 provides the result. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two rulers of Midian, escaped, yet he chased them and seized them, scattering their complete forces. Gideon accomplished his assignment. The subjugation lasting 7 years finally concluded. The alliance of Midianites, Amalekites, and eastern populations was shattered. Their rulers were seized and executed. This triumph demonstrated that although the Amalekites could establish mighty partnerships and devastate Israel when the divine permitted it, they could not endure when the divine chose to rescue his population. Gideon's modest force, strengthened by the Almighty, conquered armies including the Amalekites, regardless of their expertise and quantities. Years had elapsed since the era of the judges, and Israel now possessed a monarch. Saul had received anointing from the prophet Samuel and had guided Israel through multiple military triumphs. Yet now, Samuel approached Saul bearing a particular communication directly from the divine. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 1 establishes the context. Samuel addressed Saul, "I represent the one the Lord dispatched to anoint you ruler over his population Israel. Therefore attend carefully to the communication from the Lord." Samuel was reminding Saul of his position. He was the prophet who had anointed Saul, and he was delivering the divine's message. Saul required close attention. Then Samuel conveyed the communication. Verses 2 and 3 document the divine's instruction. This represents what the Lord Almighty declares. "I will discipline the Amalekites for their actions toward Israel when they ambushed them as they departed from Egypt. Now advance, strike the Amalekites, and completely annihilate everything belonging to them. Show no mercy to them. Execute men and women, youngsters and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." The justification for this instruction extended back centuries to Rephidim. The Almighty had not overlooked what the Amalekites had performed when they struck Israel's most vulnerable members as the population escaped bondage. The heavenly ruling declared at that moment that the divine would eliminate Amalek's identity was now receiving fulfillment. The directions were remarkably precise. Saul was required to annihilate everything. The Hebrew term employed here is herem, signifying devoted to annihilation, thoroughly destroyed. Nothing was to receive mercy or preservation. Every individual, every creature, everything the Amalekites owned required destruction. This instruction proves challenging for contemporary readers to grasp. Why such thorough annihilation? The passage references the initial transgression, the unjustified assault on defenseless refugees, the targeting of the feeble and helpless, the absolute absence of reverence for the divine. The Amalekites had transformed into a representation of resistance to the divine's intentions, and their tradition of brutality had transferred across generations. Saul obtained these directions unmistakably. No uncertainty existed, no space for alternative understanding. The prophet who had anointed him ruler stood before him, conveying the divine's direct instruction. Saul's reaction would expose much regarding his nature and his suitability to serve as monarch. Saul answered the divine's instruction by assembling his military. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 4 states, "Thus Saul called together the fighters and counted them at Telaim, 200,000 infantry and 10,000 from Judah." This represented an enormous military force, demonstrating that Saul approached the assignment with gravity and deployed substantial armed resources. Verse 5 depicts Saul's method. Saul traveled to the urban center of Amalek and arranged a surprise attack in the canyon. He employed combat tactics, arranging his troops for optimal superiority. The Amalekites possessed urban centers by this period, not merely wandering encampments, suggesting they had created more lasting communities across the centuries. Prior to striking, Saul delivered a caution to another population residing in the region. Verse 6 documents, "Then he addressed the Kenites, 'Depart, abandon the Amalekites, preventing me from annihilating you alongside them, because you demonstrated generosity to every Israelite when they departed from Egypt.' Thus, the Kenites departed from the Amalekites. The Kenites shared kinship with Moses' father-in-law and had assisted Israel throughout the Exodus. Saul ensured they would not be trapped in the annihilation, proving he could differentiate between Israel's adversaries and those who had demonstrated generosity. Then the assault commenced. Verse 7 provides the extent. Then Saul struck the Amalekites extending from Havilah to Shur, approaching the eastern boundary of Egypt. This represented a thorough operation spanning the complete expanse of Amalekite domain. From Havilah in the Arabian wasteland to Shur approaching Egypt, Saul's troops advanced through every territory the Amalekites dominated. Verse 8 depicts the combat result. He seized Agag, ruler of the Amalekites, breathing, and every one of his population he completely annihilated through the blade. From a combat perspective, this represented total triumph. Saul's troops conquered the Amalekite military, annihilated their population, and seized their ruler. The Amalekites as a combat force were shattered, their urban centers fell, their population perished in conflict. The operation displayed Saul's abilities as a combat leader. He could coordinate massive forces, devise tactical strikes, and conduct thorough operations spanning extensive domains. He had accomplished what the divine dispatched him to perform. Or had he? Saul had secured the conflict entirely. The Amalekites suffered defeat, their ruler was seized. Yet then Saul reached choices that would transform everything. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 9 discloses what transpired. Yet Saul and the military preserved Agag and the finest of the sheep and cattle, the plump calves and lambs, everything possessing worth. These they refused to annihilate thoroughly, yet everything scorned and feeble they completely annihilated. Examine that closely. Saul preserved King Agag breathing. The military preserved the finest herds, the precious creatures suitable for selling or utilizing. They annihilated solely what lacked worth or appeared feeble. This represented the precise opposite of what the divine had instructed. The Almighty declared to annihilate everything. Saul chose to preserve the precious items. Why did Saul behave this way? The passage does not provide his original reasoning, yet we can observe the pattern. The finest sheep and cattle held worth. Why squander them? King Agag represented a prize, a seized opponent ruler to display as evidence of triumph. Saul was reaching practical choices, preserving what appeared beneficial or precious. Yet these practical choices broke direct heavenly directions. The Almighty had not declared, "Annihilate everything besides the precious items." He declared, "Show no mercy to them." No exception provision existed, no authorization to apply human reasoning to alter the instruction. Verse 12 reveals what Saul performed following the conflict. At dawn, Samuel arose and traveled to encounter Saul. Yet he received information: Saul has traveled to Carmel. There he has constructed a memorial honoring himself and has departed, continuing toward Gilgal. Saul traveled to Carmel and raised a memorial to himself. He was honoring his triumph, commemorating his accomplishment, constructing something to glorify his personal identity. This memorial discloses Saul's thinking. He perceived this operation as his achievement, his triumph, his accomplishment. He felt pride regarding his actions. He desired people to recall his combat achievement, yet he had overlooked something essential. This was not his assignment to complete according to his preference. This represented the divine's verdict being performed through him. The difference is severe. The Almighty declared to eliminate Amalek's identity. Saul constructed a memorial to his personal identity. The Almighty declared to annihilate everything. Saul preserved the finest of everything. The Almighty provided explicit instructions. Saul altered them according to his personal reasoning. While Saul was honoring his triumph and constructing memorials, the Almighty was addressing Samuel. What the divine declared that evening would signify a pivotal moment in Israel's chronicle. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 10. Documents: Then the message of the Lord reached Samuel. This occurred during darkness after the conflict concluded and while Saul remained at Carmel. The Almighty did not delay for Samuel to uncover Saul's defiance. He disclosed it directly to his prophet. Verse 11 holds the divine's crushing declaration. I feel sorrow that I established Saul as ruler because he has departed from me and has not fulfilled my directions. The term sorrow here communicates profound grief and anguish. Not that the Almighty committed an error. The divine grieved that Saul had fallen short, that the individual selected to serve as ruler had departed from compliance. Samuel's reaction demonstrates how profoundly this influenced him. The verse proceeds, Samuel experienced fury, and he pleaded to the Lord throughout that entire evening. Samuel devoted the complete night to supplication, crying toward the divine. He experienced fury, whether toward Saul, toward the circumstances, or toward the consequences. We receive no explanation. Yet he was deeply disturbed and beseeched the divine throughout the darkness. Why was Saul's defiance so grave? He had secured the conflict. He had conquered the Amalekites through combat. He had annihilated most of what the divine instructed. Was that insufficient? Yet the divine's viewpoint differed. Incomplete compliance represents defiance. When the Almighty provides particular directions, following most while disregarding portions does not qualify as compliance. The particular matter concerned what the divine had instructed regarding Amalek. This was not merely another conflict or another adversary. This represented the performance of a heavenly verdict declared centuries earlier at Rephidim. The Almighty personally had announced conflict against Amalek. He had pledged to eliminate their identity. Saul's function was serving as the instrument of that heavenly verdict, not altering it according to his personal wisdom. Through preserving Agag and retaining the finest herds, Saul demonstrated he trusted his personal reasoning above the divine's instruction. He determined what should suffer annihilation and what should receive preservation. He replaced his wisdom for the divine's explicit directions. This disclosed a fundamental difficulty with Saul's nature. He would comply with the Almighty when it appeared sensible to him, yet he would modify or disregard instructions that failed to match his comprehension. The divine sorrow regarding establishing Saul as ruler signified the connection was shattered. Saul had demonstrated himself unsuitable for the position. A ruler of Israel required complete compliance with the divine, not selective compliance. The kingdom required a leader who would trust the divine's instructions, even when they lacked practical sense. The morning following his evening of supplication, Samuel journeyed to locate Saul. 1 Samuel 15 verse 12 states he received information that Saul had traveled to Carmel and afterward to Gilgal. Samuel traveled to Gilgal to challenge the ruler. Verse 13 depicts their encounter. When Samuel arrived before him, Saul declared, "The Lord grant you favor. I have fulfilled the Lord's directions." Saul welcomed Samuel with assurance, even requesting the divine's favor upon the prophet. Then he asserted total compliance. "I have fulfilled the Lord's directions." In Saul's perception, he had completed the assignment successfully. Samuel's reaction came immediately and sharply. Verse 14, documents. Yet Samuel declared, "What then represents this crying of sheep reaching my hearing? What represents this bellowing of cattle that I detect?" Samuel could perceive the creatures Saul had preserved. The proof of disobedience was literally generating sounds surrounding them. Saul asserted total compliance, while encircled by evidence of his incomplete compliance. Saul attempted to clarify. Verse 15 provides his response. Saul responded, "The fighters transported them from the Amalekites. They preserved the finest of the sheep and cattle to present as offerings to the Lord your deity, yet we completely annihilated the remainder." Observe Saul's justification. Initially, he assigned fault to the fighters. They preserved the creatures, not I preserved them. He transferred accountability away from himself. Additionally, he asserted a sacred intention. The creatures would serve as offerings to the divine. He was presenting defiance as devotion. Samuel remained unimpressed. Verses 16 to 19 document his reaction. "Sufficient," Samuel declared to Saul. "Permit me to inform you what the Lord communicated to me during the night." "Inform me," Saul answered. Samuel declared, "Though you previously appeared insignificant in your personal perception, did you not become the leader of the clans of Israel? The Lord anointed you ruler over Israel, and he dispatched you on an assignment declaring, 'Advance and thoroughly annihilate those corrupt individuals, the Amalekites. Conduct warfare against them until you have eliminated them completely.' Why did you refuse to comply with the Lord? Why did you seize upon the stolen goods and commit wrong in the perception of the Lord?" Samuel penetrated Saul's justifications. The divine had provided explicit directions. Saul had selected to seize stolen goods instead. The sacred rationalization held no significance. The instruction was to annihilate everything, not to preserve the finest for offerings. Saul attempted once more to justify himself. Verse 20 documents, "Yet I did comply with the Lord," Saul declared. "I proceeded on the assignment the Lord gave me. I thoroughly annihilated the Amalekites and transported back Agag, their ruler." Saul maintained he had complied, even while acknowledging he transported back the ruler breathing, the precise thing the divine instructed him not to perform. Then Samuel spoke one of the renowned declarations in Scripture. Verses 22 and 23 document, "Yet Samuel answered, 'Does the Lord find pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices equally as in complying with the Lord? To comply surpasses sacrifice, and to listen surpasses the fat of rams.' Because rebellion resembles the transgression of sorcery, and pride resembles the wickedness of idol worship. Since you have dismissed the message of the Lord, he has dismissed you as ruler." Samuel's declarations struck at the core of the matter. Sacred ceremonies do not replace compliance. You cannot defy the divine and afterward present him offerings from the gains of your defiance. Compliance represents what the divine desires. Saul's incomplete compliance actually constituted rebellion, dismissing the divine's message, and that rebellion proved equally grave as sorcery or idol worship. The concluding statement proved crushing. "He has dismissed you as ruler." The monarchy was being removed from Saul. His lineage would not persist, entirely because he altered the divine's explicit instruction concerning the Amalekites. Following Samuel's declaration that Saul was dismissed as ruler, Saul ultimately acknowledged his transgression. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verses 24 and 25 document, "Then Saul addressed Samuel, 'I have transgressed. I broke the Lord's instruction and your directions. I experienced fear of the fighters, and therefore I yielded to them. Currently I implore you, pardon my transgression and return alongside me, enabling me to worship the Lord.' Saul acknowledged wrongdoing, assigned fault to his fear of the population, and requested pardon. Yet Samuel's reaction demonstrated the harm was permanent. Verse 26 states, "Yet Samuel addressed him, 'I will not return alongside you. You have dismissed the message of the Lord, and the Lord has dismissed you as ruler over Israel.' Samuel declined to accompany Saul for worship. The dismissal remained firm. As Samuel rotated to depart, Saul seized his garment and it ripped. Samuel utilized even this occurrence to communicate a message. Verses 27 and 28 document. As Samuel rotated to depart, Saul grasped the edge of his garment and it ripped. Samuel addressed him, "The Lord has ripped the monarchy of Israel from you this day, and has bestowed it to one of your fellow countrymen, to someone superior to you." Following additional exchange, Samuel ultimately consented to accompany Saul for worship, yet then he addressed the incomplete matter. Verse 32 states, "Then Samuel declared, 'Transport to me Agag, ruler of the Amalekites.' Agag approached him in restraints. Certain translations indicate Agag approached with assurance or contentment, implying he believed the threat had concluded. He had received preservation when everyone else perished. Perhaps he trusted he would receive permission to survive. Verse 32 proceeds with Agag's declaration, and Agag declared, "Certainly the harshness of death has concluded." Agag believed he was protected. He had endured the conflict. He had remained breathing for days. Certainly, if they intended to slay him, they would have performed it previously. Yet Samuel had different intentions. Verse 33 documents Samuel's declaration and deed. Yet Samuel declared, "As your blade has rendered women without offspring, likewise will your mother become without offspring among women." And Samuel executed Agag before the Lord at Gilgal. Samuel personally performed the execution of the Amalekite ruler, recalling his personal brutality before completing the verdict Saul had neglected to finish. Samuel's declarations exposed something regarding Agag's nature and deeds. "Your blade has rendered women without offspring." Agag had served as a savage ruler, slaying men and abandoning widows and orphans. His reign had been distinguished by brutality and cruelty. Currently, he would encounter the identical destiny he had delivered upon others. The execution transpired before the Lord at Gilgal, in a location of worship, as a deed of finishing heavenly verdict. Samuel personally guaranteed that the divine's instruction received complete fulfillment, despite the ruler having neglected to perform it. Years elapsed, and David emerged as the subsequent ruler. The fellow countryman Samuel had referenced who surpassed Saul. Yet before David claimed the throne, he experienced his personal confrontations with the Amalekites throughout his years as a refugee from Saul. David spent periods residing among the Philistines for protection. The Philistine ruler Achish provided him the settlement of Ziklag as headquarters. 1 Samuel 27, 8-9 portrayed David's operations. Currently, David and his fighters advanced and plundered the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient periods, these populations had resided in the territory stretching toward Shur and Egypt. Whenever David struck a region, he preserved no man or woman breathing, yet seized sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels. and garments. Then he would return toward Achish. David was plundering Amalekite domain, advancing the conflict the divine had announced against them. He seized their herds and possessions, and he guaranteed nobody endured to communicate his operations. When Achish questioned where he had plundered, David would provide deceptive responses, preserving his deception while genuinely battling Israel's adversaries. Yet then catastrophe arrived. 1 Samuel 31:2 portray what transpired. David and his fighters arrived at Ziklag on the third day. Currently, the Amalekites had plundered the Negev and Ziklag. They had struck Ziklag and incinerated it, and had seized as prisoners the women and everyone else within it, both youthful and aged. They slew none of them, yet transported them away as they proceeded on their path. While David was absent, Amalekite plunderers had struck Ziklag. They incinerated the settlement and seized everyone as prisoners, including David's two spouses, Ahinoam and Abigail. Thus, David and his fighters wept loudly until they possessed no energy remaining to weep. The devastation proved complete. Everything had vanished. Everyone they cherished was seized. David's personal fighters turned against him in their sorrow. David experienced severe distress because the fighters were discussing stoning him. Every individual felt bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. Yet David discovered strength in the Lord his deity. In his most desperate instant, David turned toward the divine for strength. David consulted the Lord through the priest Abiathar, questioning whether he should chase the plunderers. Verses 7 and 8 document, "Then David addressed Abiathar the priest, the offspring of Ahimelech, 'Transport to me the ephod.' Abiathar transported it toward him, and David consulted the Lord. 'Should I chase this plundering group? Will I reach them?' 'Chase them,' he responded. 'You will absolutely reach them and accomplish the rescue.' David gathered 600 fighters and commenced pursuit. They discovered an Egyptian servant who had been abandoned by the Amalekites when he grew ill. This individual consented to guide David toward the plundering group. Verses 16 and 17 portray what David discovered. He guided David downward, and there they appeared, dispersed across the terrain, consuming, drinking, and celebrating because of the enormous quantity of stolen goods they had seized from the territory of the Philistines and from Judah. David battled them from darkness until the evening of the subsequent day, and none of them escaped, besides 400 youthful fighters who departed on camels and escaped. David struck and battled for a complete day and evening. Verse 18 provides the result. David retrieved everything the Amalekites had seized, including his two spouses. He liberated everyone and everything. Verse 19 supplements, "Nothing was absent, youthful or aged, male child or female child, stolen goods or anything else they had seized." David transported everything back. The Amalekites had seized prisoners rather than slaying them, possibly intending to trade them as servants. This choice permitted David to liberate everyone breathing, yet the Amalekite plunderers themselves suffered destruction besides 400 who escaped on camels. One final significant reference to an Amalekite emerges in the Bible's account, and it links directly to Saul's conclusion. Following Saul's death in conflict against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, a youthful individual approached David bearing information. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verses 1 and 2 establish the context. Following the passing of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and remained in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, an individual arrived from Saul's encampment with his garments ripped and soil upon his head. This messenger approached with dramatic indicators of mourning. Verses 3 and 4 portray the exchange. When he approached David, he descended to the ground to display respect. "From where have you arrived?" David questioned him. He responded, I have escaped from the Israelite encampment." "What transpired?" David questioned. "Inform me." "The fighters escaped from the conflict," he declared. "Many of them collapsed and perished, and Saul and his offspring Jonathan have perished." David questioned how he understood Saul and Jonathan had perished. The youthful individual's response emerges in verses 6 through 10. He declared, "I occurred to be on Mount Gilboa, and there stood Saul, supporting himself on his spear with the chariots and their operators in aggressive pursuit. When he rotated and observed me, he called toward me, and I responded, 'What can I perform?' He questioned me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I responded. Then he addressed me, 'Position yourself here beside me and slay me.' I experience the agonies of death, yet I remain breathing. Thus I positioned myself beside him and slew him because I understood that following his collapse, he could not endure. And I seized the crown resting upon his head and the band upon his arm and have transported them here to my master." Whether this account proved accurate or the Amalekite was deceiving to obtain approval remains disputed. Yet David's reaction proved immediate. Verses 14 through 16 document David questioned him, "Why did you not fear to extend your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David summoned one of his fighters and declared, "Advance, strike him down." Thus he struck him down and he perished. Because David had addressed him, "Your blood rests upon your personal head. Your personal mouth provided testimony against you when you declared, 'I slew the Lord's anointed.'" David performed execution upon the Amalekite for asserting he slew Saul, despite Saul having served as David's adversary. The Lord's anointed ruler was not to suffer death regardless of circumstances. The irony proved complete. Saul forfeited his monarchy for preserving an Amalekite ruler, and currently an Amalekite asserted he had slain Saul. Following this moment, references to Amalekites in Scripture grow scarce. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 43 references one concluding confrontation, stating that they annihilated the surviving Amalekites who had fled, and they have resided there until the present day. This transpired throughout King Hezekiah's reign, centuries following Saul. Certain Simeonites struck a remnant of Amalekites who had escaped toward the highland region of Seir. By the era of the separated kingdoms and the subsequent biblical period, the Amalekites had vanished as a distinguishable population. The population that previously dominated the southern wasteland, that had struck Israel at Rephidim, that had established partnerships and plundered communities, they had disappeared. The heavenly ruling declared at Rephidim had achieved completion. Their identity was eliminated. Their existence as a population terminated entirely. If this expedition through biblical chronicles has revealed particulars you have never observed previously, do not retain it privately. Press that subscribe button, ensuring you will not overlook our subsequent thorough examination into Scripture's most captivating accounts. Distribute this video with someone who appreciates biblical chronicles or anyone inquisitive regarding the lesser recognized populations of Scripture, and inform us in the comments which element of the Amalekite account astonished you greatest. Until the following occasion, continue investigating the Divine's Word. There consistently remains additional material to uncover.